far as 30 years ago, what was the concept of artificial intelligence in our society then, or was it just a sort of like a Jetsons-like dream?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll go back even a little bit further than 30 years ago. And we do this in the course as well, because I really think it's important that people understand the history of the technologies and some of the decisions back at the time that kind of informed where the technology landed today. So I'm going to take you back to the 1950s and talk a little bit about the early days of computing. And as you can imagine, computing was just starting to come into its own as a particular industry or basically a field at that point in time. And it was in 1956 that a group of professors went off to Dartmouth College over the summer, and they coined the term artificial intelligence. And there was this dream essentially of building some kind of system, machine that could have human-like goals. And it was sort of informed by some work that Alan Turing had done. And Alan Turing is kind of known as the father, let's say, of artificial intelligence. And he wrote this seminal paper in, I believe it was 1948, that basically kind of set out this idea that one day we would build a machine that was able to fool a human into thinking that this machine was human. And that became known as the Turing test. And that became kind of the standard for this artificial intelligence technology. But as you can imagine, this wasn't something that was super easy to do. So the kinds of computing power that they had in those days were pretty limited, certainly nowhere near the kinds of computing power that we have right now that we all carry around with us every day in our pocket that lives on a smartphone, nothing even close to that. And so a lot of these systems in the early days were very rules-based. They were very programmed and fairly what we might think of as quite rudimentary at the time. So that was kind of the early days of artificial intelligence. And I guess the other important thing to say about those early days is a lot of the funding came from military sources. It wasn't unlike the internet, where a lot of the funding and the development came from a military agenda. And so that was kind of what was fueling the development and the funding and the research of that day. So what happens is everybody at the time was super excited. They thought they were going to get a Jetsons-like reality. There was a lot of hype. And unfortunately, it didn't pan out. And that became this cycle in artificial intelligence where all this hype would happen, things wouldn't pan out, the funding disappeared, people went away, and then another 10 years would go by and there'd be another hype cycle. And it kind of went through this hype cycle a few different times. Until more recently in 2012, where we had some major breakthroughs in computing power that were able to really take the vision that had been developed, 30, 40 years ago, and even some of the early work in algorithms, and make it an actual reality by putting together three things: lots of data that we got through the internet, the computing power that we had now that it was 2012 at the time, and all of this work on algorithms. So all of that kind of came together fairly recently.